Okay, let's get going here. Okay, so, wow, big crowd for Intro to Methods today. Okay. Must have watched my very amusing video from Friday where we critiqued bad survey questions. Nothing that fun this time, sadly. Okay. All right, so we're going to keep going talking about survey questions. My goal is to have this done on Wednesday so that when you go into the mini lab or the lab on Thursday, that day after Wednesday, you'll have kind of the basic set of survey writing skills. Yeah, so anything anyone needs to talk about or ask questions about before I jump in? As you know, probably next Wednesday is going to be midterm for the course, right? So we have the Thanksgiving holiday, and then coming back, it'll be the midterm on Wednesday the 16th, I think. And I can talk about that probably on Friday and give you a little like rundown of what that looks like. But just a reminder, it's 30 multiple choice questions, very basic. 4 short answer questions, 2 of them are kind of definitions, 2 of them are applications. So using some of the skills you practiced in the mini labs. No big deal. It should all be fine. And it's written in class, on Canvas, and all that fun stuff. But anyway, sorry. I'll tell you about it on Friday, and then I just told you. I want people to like not worry about stuff. Okay, any questions though before I jump in? Yeah, please.
Sorry, did you say online?
So it's on Canvas. You're going to write it on Canvas, but you have to come into class that day because it will have a password on it, so you can't access it unless I give you the password. If you have accommodations, I'm going to set it up so you can write it remotely. But I haven't checked how many people have accommodations in this class yet. But so we can talk about that if you have accommodations. We can chat about that sometime or not. I'll send you an email. Any other questions? Okay, good. All right. Oh wait, no, I'm kidding. Okay, so we were talking about designing survey questions, and I've mentioned this before. But one of the things that is really beneficial and something that I strongly recommend for anyone who's doing survey design is if you want to know about a particular kind of human problem, right? A social problem or something that you're interested in, like a human behavior, a feeling. The first thing you should do is go to Google and just, check, like type into Google something like, you want to know about loneliness, scale for measuring loneliness, right? Or scale for measuring XYZ, right? Happiness, life satisfaction, whatever it is you kind of want to throw into your kind of research study. Why? Because, it's more likely that an existing scale that was created by people, who are professionals and that has been kind of refined over time is going to give you better results than you trying to come up with your own scale to measure something, right? And I've talked before about, people trying to create like their own scale to measure depression and not really knowing what kind of questions one would ask that would get you a good read on whether someone, exhibits signs of depression. So definitely feel free to use existing scales, right? And I mentioned before the UCLA Loneliness Index. If you wanted to kind of low-key try and understand whether someone has a attention deficit disorder or ADHD, right, you could use something like the questions from the SNAP-4. There's lots of analytic tools that you could use to try and figure out, where someone sits. And I mean, you know that they worked well, right? They've worked well and people created them. They've been refined over time. You do have to cite the original source, but that's no problem, right? You're all good at that. And yeah, you could then use, say, your study, you can compare it to other studies if you used similar question sets, right? Or question sets that look similar. And that said, you can always modify it to suit your own purposes. You can cut out questions, you can, modify things. So there's lots of options using existing scales, but they're really, really useful for not reinventing the wheel. And it makes operationalization a snap, right? Because you say, I'm going to measure loneliness using the 20 questions from the UCLA Loneliness Index. Operationalization for that variable, done, right? So there's a lot of advantages to using existing scales, and don't always feel like you have to reinvent the wheel, right? I know, we're talking about survey design, but I don't want to just like make you run through the motions. Also want to give you some best practices for doing it. Okay, you can barely see that because it's really, really small. But hang on. I tried to just throw in, this is the UCLA Loneliness Index. I can zoom. Schmancy. Okay. I did not know I could do that. You learn something new every day. This is just an example, right? So this is what the UCLA loneliness scale looks like. And this is what you would potentially put on, say, a questionnaire, right? And you don't have this because I just copied and pasted, but literally if you look up UCLA loneliness scale, you'll find a web page that gives you this. So like if you look at the kind of questions, right? All of these are measured on a 1 to 4 scale, right? Always, 4 being always, 3 being sometimes, 2 being rarely, and 1 being never. And you would just have people run through, these sorts of things. How often do you feel that you're in tune with the people around you? Do you lack companionship? All of these things, right? So these are, how often do you feel close to people? How often do you feel left out? How often do you feel that your relationships with others are not meaningful, right? So again, I won't read off every question, but I think what's valuable in kind of looking at something like this is to just realize that if you were coming up with a way of measuring loneliness, you're probably not going to come up with these questions, right? Like just off the top of your head, you might come up with a few of these, but this scale, it's been battle tested by researchers for decades, and it's a really good tool for measuring something like loneliness. Back to mini zoom. All right, oops, I went forward. So just keep that in mind, right? There's a ton of existing scales out there. Almost anything that you can imagine, you can find an existing scale that deals with it. Okay, so questionnaires, right? So I'm going to make a kind of distinction between straight questionnaires and structured interviews, right? So a structured interview is basically when someone using, all of the questions from a questionnaire administers that in person, right? Or on the phone. So, you phone up somebody and you have your list of questions from the UCLA Loneliness Index because you want to see, how many senior citizens in Alberta are lonely, right? So that's a structured interview. Now, straight up questionnaires or surveys are the same thing. They're just done without the interviewer. These used to be done by mail, right? People would mail out questionnaires. Now, almost all of this is done online. So, basically, a straight up questionnaire or survey. All right, the more colloquial form is just survey. That's an E. Survey. Far more popular now, and it's just, there's a couple of problems now with structured interviews that I've mentioned. They're super time consuming and expensive. If you saw the budget for how much money we're spending through the CCR's current research project, and we're doing 6 waves of interviews with about 1,500 people, and paying them for each wave, and then paying people to interview them. The budget is in the, well above $250,000 at this point. We're not even close to done. So structured interviews are super, super expensive. Just sending out surveys is much cheaper. Now, advantages, or disadvantages, I guess. You can fill out the forms, right? It used to be by mail. Now it's increasingly online. Because the respondent has to read the questionnaire without the aid of the interviewer, it has to be super clear and easy to follow, right? So you don't have the advantage of having someone explain or see, that someone might not understand what the question's asking. So your questions do have to be a little bit on the basic side. And this is the problem with a lot of surveys that I've done online, is that they're hard to understand. You don't really understand what the survey maker was looking for, and so it can be hard to answer things. Okay. Compared to interviews, right, you can't get as much qualitative data in a structured, so as you would in a structured interview, right? Because, if you're just having a conversation with someone, you could have them say a few sentences on a topic, or you could be like, oh, could you tell us your opinion in your own words about XYZ? And if you're recording that, it gets transcribed later. Asking people to fill out boxes, right, your little com boxes on a web page, tends to not work as well. People will give you 2 words, and they're much, much less likely to do a really good job on it. Okay, so yeah, you tend to have fewer open questions. Simple design, so the respondent can complete all the sections without difficulty. They have to be relatively short because people will quit. I think the kind of rule of thumb, for me anyway, is that any survey should take about 15 to 25 minutes to complete, right? At max. If you can make it shorter, like 10 minutes, you're going to get a much higher response rate. The problem being at 10 minutes, it really limits how many questions you can ask, right? So the sweet spot is about 15 to 25 minutes. When you get to I almost guarantee this, if you get to half an hour, you say this survey is going to take you about half an hour to complete, fewer people are going to start that because a half hour is a decent chunk of time. So you know how when you see prices, they always put prices at $19.99 instead of $20 so that you think it's cheaper because your brain is stupid. It's the same thing with kind of survey times, right? If you put 30 minutes, that seems like a lot. If you put 25, that seems like less because it's not an even number of it's not half of an hour, right? So generally speaking, I would say 30 minutes is going to be really on the longish side, and you're going to have people mostly not do the survey at all, or certainly people quitting. 25 seems to be a pretty good number. Again, people build in the discount. It's this survey is only 25 minutes as opposed to, oh my God, this survey is 30 minutes. So just keep that in mind. 30 minutes, you're just going to have fewer people start. Now that said, never, ever, 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 ever tell people that it's going to take 25 minutes to do your survey and it actually takes them 35 or 40, because your desistance rate is going to be enormous, right? And even now, right, if you look at a typical survey that you see online, it's going to have a little status bar in the corner. And if that status bar doesn't move fast enough for people, honestly, it's going to show percent, right? And if you've done 15 pages of this survey and that status bar hasn't moved fast enough, people are going to be like, oh my God, I still have 75% of this survey to do. Forget it, I quit, right? And then again, all that data is garbage. So never falsely advertise how long it's going to take to do your survey. And I've seen people do this too, and it's infuriating because it's this is a 25-minute survey. And I'm like, how long have I been doing this? It's 40 minutes. And then you're just to hell with you guys. So don't do that. And keep in mind, most web platforms have this little bar. So you have to kind of keep things moving briskly too. And again, if people see, wow, I'm already 25% done, that doesn't feel like anything, they're going to keep going. If it's wow, I'm 2% done, maybe I'll go wax my goldfish again. He needs a good shine. Or something like that. So yeah, it's super easy to quit, right? You close the app on your phone or you close the browser window that you're in. So don't overstress people and never ever falsely advertise how long it's going to take. Marketers do this all the time. Marketers are kind of the worst. Okay, so advantages over structured interviews, they're way cheaper. You can probably do a national survey of, I'm trying to think, maybe these prices are maybe 4 years old, but a national survey of about 4,000 people through one of the big survey platforms is probably somewhere in the range of $12,000, right? And that's like getting them to gather the people, to collect the people off their platforms, to have them run through the survey, and you're going to get yourself a nationally representative sample that's sorted. And often they'll clean up the data for you too. Versus, honestly, like I said, the CCR, the current prison project they're doing, we're talking about thousands of dollars, like tens, even hundreds of thousands of dollars to interview, 1,500 people. Mind you, we're interviewing some of them 6 times, but hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that project. So you can get your data cheap, quick. Right now, if I recall, the turnaround time for approximately 3,000 people nationally representative for Abacus, and Abacus is one of these ones. Do you want to guess how many days it's going to take them to gather all that data? So you pay them, you give them your survey, take you about 4 days to get the data. Which means, if you are if you have $12,000 to pay to Abacus to run this survey for you, you can get your data and then you can start working on it in about 4 days. Now, the analysis obviously is going to take you a while, but compare that to someone like the project that we're doing in the CCR. It's going to take us about 2 years to gather all of the data with these structured interviews with people sitting down, and even like to physically interview 1,500 people, let alone 3,000, would be months, right? It'd be months. So you can get this data really, really quickly. And I know $12,000 probably seems like a lot, but in kind of research terms and in data gathering terms, it's a pittance, right? It's almost nothing. It's actually shocking how cheap you can get data for in this way. And especially like if you've applied, don't spend money out of your own bank account to do this, but if you get research funding, this really is not a lot of money. So very, very quick. Okay, no interviewer effect, right? So you don't have any possibility of, say, like an interviewer effect, right? So you have 25 different people that are administering your surveys, and maybe some of them explain questions a little bit differently. They read the questions with a little bit different emphasis, which might change some of the way people understand things. So you don't have to worry about interviewer effects, right? Or training, right? That's the nice thing about an online platform or a paper survey, which nobody does anymore, is you don't have to train anybody on how to deliver the tool. So again, cost is lower. Social desirability bias seems to be reduced for the most part. Now, again, this is a little bit of a disputed claim because people still have this sense of over-reporting good behaviors and under-reporting bad behaviors, even on surveys, even anonymous surveys. There's always going to be some degree of social desirability bias. This is probably only a big issue, if you're doing sensitive research, stuff that people might either inflate if they're actually talking to a real person, or minimize if they're talking to a real person, right? So notoriously, right, one of the ways that this plays out is any kind of research on sex, people will underreport behaviors that they, for some reason, think are undesirable, like number of sexual partners, all this sort of stuff, pornography use. There's a lot of social desirability bias. It's a little bit better with an anonymous sample. Or weird things like, and this is always a really disputed number, is things like religious service attendance. And there's a huge dispute. There's actually a funny kind of debate going on in the field right now of sociology of religion, because it's something like in the US, about something around 30% of people report attending religious services once a week, at least. But someone did a really weird thing, and they basically were like, let's take GPS data from phones, right? So you can buy this stuff in mass because all of your data is being bought and sold all the time. And so basically this person bought this lot of marketing data, which includes location data, And he's like, yeah, literally like 2% of the population of this city is moving around on a Sunday morning. Everyone else is at home. So he's like, actually, about 28% of the people are lying, right? Like they're just lying. Nobody's going to church on Sunday. Otherwise, the roads on Sunday mornings would be like, rush hour traffic. But that's a social desirability thing. It's like people who maybe say that they have a religious identity are like, I really should be going to religious services every week, but I don't. But I'm just going to answer on this poll, yeah, I go every week because that's what I like to do, right? I would feel better about myself if I did that. It's a little bit better online, but still, it's never perfect. Okay. I didn't read my own Dilbert cartoon. I put these in to spice things up. Okay. Yeah, so disadvantages of questionnaires, no one's there to explain the question, right? So if someone doesn't understand your question, the likelihood of kind of quitting or answering the question improperly is going to be relatively higher. Greater risk of missing data because of lack of probing or supervision, right? That people might not answer certain questions, certain things might be missing. Questionnaires, obviously, you need to keep the question short, right? And you need to keep the questionnaire itself short so people will complete it. So it's hard to ask a lot of questions. Open questions are terrible online. So you wouldn't want to, I don't think they work very well in an online format. They work much better in a phone or an in-person kind of structured interview. Can't track whether the questions were answered in the original order. I mean, online platforms can do this a little bit better. You can see how people answered, and you can the nice thing about online is that you can really structure things in particular so that people have to answer one part of the survey before moving on to the next. So that was more of an issue with paper surveys, and is less of an issue today. Yeah, I mean, some topics and some respondents, questionnaires might not be appropriate, right? It might be really difficult. I think minors, especially not the dig underground kind, the under the age of 18, especially younger kids, right? If you wanted to get data, questionnaires can be really difficult. So you definitely, a structured interview would be a more appropriate thing. And it is a little bit harder when you get to kind of figuring out your sample and making sure that you have an exact read on your population and that the people inside your sample fit your population exactly. Getting your designated respondents and the kinds of people that you want is a much bigger challenge with questionnaires, right? So the online platforms help filter a bit, but there's also some self-selection bias that gets in the way. Okay. Yeah, so I think web surveys, I think we're almost, all today looking at doing web surveys. They're so much quicker. They're so much easier. The beautiful thing about it also is design. Like when you do online surveys, even compared to a paper survey from the past, online surveys are so beautiful to look at, and you can really design them down to the smallest element that you want, right? You can control how people move through them. You can have your forced questions be really forced questions, right? So like if you need a specific piece of data, and you can play around in this in like Qualtrics. Qualtrics is the big platform that universities use. And if you ever want to do a survey, U of A actually has a subscription to Qualtrics. And all you have to do is like send an email to testing and questionnaire services, or test scoring and questionnaire services, TSQS, and they will hook you up with Qualtrics, right? So if you ever want to do like a survey and you have kind of reasonable grounds, the U of A actually pays for a service that you can use. And they do such a good job advertising it that it took us 4 months to figure this out at the CCR. Because we're like, what platform should we use? And it's like, oh, wait, we pay out for this platform already and we don't need to pay at like a penny for it? Oh, well, we should do that. Yeah, like after screwing around with meetings with like 5 different platform reps who are like, oh, we're dumb. So yeah, if you ever want to do a survey, Qualtrics, kind of industry standard in universities, and the U of A has a subscription, and as students, you have access to that, so you could use that. But platforms like SurveyMonkey, and then there's some slightly, well, SurveyMonkey Pro is actually pretty decent, but there's some upscale ones as well that you can get. The weird thing though, you can actually pay SurveyMonkey to recruit participants for you. It's ridiculously expensive, but if you create a survey on SurveyMonkey, you can do this thing where they find your participants for you, and it's like you can set it down to the postal code. Like if you wanted just people from a particular part of Edmonton, you can set it and they will find you how many number of participants. Now, if it's very limited geographically, it is going to cost you a damn fortune, but it's doable. I played around with all this stuff a few years ago. It's really kind of neat. You're like, make the circle smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It's like, ooh, I want 400 participants from here. It's like $11 million. Bigger circle, bigger circle. And the bigger the circle, the lower the price goes. Anyway, there's so many options with web surveys. They're really elegant. Design, flow, branching, right? So that if a person answers like this, it branches and they go to these sets of questions. I cannot tell you, like, I've looked at some of the phone survey data from years ago when people were doing a ton of phone surveys, and there's branches, right? So if a person answers yes here, the interviewer has to follow down this branch of questioning. To actually read that is super confusing, right? And you see some of these surveys that were designed, and it's like, okay, they answered yes on this question, so then you branch, and then another yes, and it branches down here. I don't know how people ever kept this stuff straight. It must have taken so much training. You do it once in something like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, and it's honestly glorious because as long as it'll just branch. You have to set the logic and you can screw things up, which is super fun when you cannot find the error in your own survey. You're like, you do the test run and it's like logic error, and you're like, where? And it's like, oh, you made the mistake. The computer doesn't know where you made the mistake. But generally speaking, once you get what's called logic right and the routing, it's beautiful and it runs perfectly every single time. Web survey. Yeah, responses generally can be downloaded right into a database, and the data is mostly pretty cleaned up. And usually you can format it for a couple of platforms. SPSS is the big one. Stata or Stat-A, and then R, that dreaded open source program that you all probably got to play with. R is great, and data visualization in R is like the best. Everybody uses it, except government, which uses this, because it looks like it was designed for Windows 95, and I guess government likes that for some reason. If you've ever used SPSS, you'll know what I mean, because it honestly looks like, maybe it was designed in the 90s. But yeah, downloading it directly into your software is great. Sometimes Excel too. I have friends who insist that everything should be done in Excel. I don't agree. R is more fun, but Excel is pretty decent as well. So that is a great advantage. Obviously, you don't have to transcribe anything, and you can download stuff automatically. Okay. Yeah, so designing the questionnaire. How am I doing for time? Clear presentation. You want things to be easy on the eyes. And like I said, I was talking last time about like grid questionnaires, right? Where it's like a bunch of options or a bunch of questions that are just on a grid, and all your answers are in like a grid format. They can be kind of ugly to look at and hard to follow. And I mean, if you've ever done any of these, you'll notice even easy things like one line is white, one line is blue, one line is white, one line is blue. Online makes it really, really easy to design beautiful looking surveys. Makes it relatively easy for people to kind of answer questions. And you can structure how you want things set up, how many questions per page, what questions should be grouped together. You get to design all of that stuff in a way that makes a lot more sense than paper surveys ever did. So they are beautiful. And yeah, like you can set up things that look really nice, and that always helps. And is not overwhelming, which also helps. Okay. Oh, I love research-driven diaries. Okay, another kind of questionnaire that people sometimes do are research-driven diaries. Yeah. I think this has been typical of media research, right? I've seen media research done this way, and in very rare examples, like I've heard of people keeping like using these kinds of research-driven diaries for things like romantic lives, sex lives. Because people got to be a little bit more honest about it, and it was less kind of structured. Research-driven diaries basically is where you have someone fill in information about their life, about something that they're doing, some kind of behavior, kind of keeping track of it so that you can then kind of access that data, hopefully from a little bit more of an organic point of view, right? So if you want to know what people are doing in terms of media behavior, like what are they consuming in terms of media, I've seen people like, it used to be like an actual book that you would then mail back to places. Now it's a website that you go onto and you're like, on Monday, what music did you listen to? How long did you listen to the radio for? That's the thing in your car at the center that you connect your Bluetooth to. Before the Bluetooth comes on, it has these stations that no one listens to. That's a radio. Sorry, terrible old person joke. Don't get me started on like audio cassettes. We'll be here all day. So yeah, I mean, people will write down, I listened to 107.1 for 3 minutes until my phone connected to my car. Or whatever it happens to be, right? So and I've seen this used in a couple of different settings. They're really useful for like behavior, sometimes food, right? So if you're wanting to figure out what people are eating, right, you have them keep a sort of food diary. So almost like they would, like a food tracker on your phone. You would have them go into the same thing and be like, they ate 1 apple at 1 p.m. To figure out what people are eating. I've seen that done to get kind of quantitative information on food that people are eating and all that kind of stuff. Very rarely, there was one study was like people's dating and sex lives, because apparently on a regular survey, it was impossible to get reliable data. But for some reason, people were super honest in these research-driven diaries because they just kind of put things in their own words, right? So yeah, they put them, their perception and actions shortly after they happen, right? So it's usually once a day people are supposed to do these things. Now making sure they actually do them, that is a challenge, but that's neither here nor there. And yeah, explicit instructions on how to complete diaries, time periods for recording responses, and the types of experiences to be recorded, right? So people have to know what they're recording, because if you're like, what music do you listen to? You don't want them to start talking about the TV shows they watch, right? But they're pretty easy for the most part. Use these for quantitative and qualitative research. I actually think they're better for qualitative research, but certainly in things like nutrition research, what people are eating, research on exercise, they can be useful quantitatively as well. But I think when people actually have to type a few thoughts in, you get much more interesting data out of research-driven diaries. I've never seen a student propose a research-driven diary as a project, but they are very interesting. Okay. Yeah, so advantages over an interview and questionnaire. They tend to be fairly accurate, about things like frequency or time spent on behaviors. And yeah, it's good for getting data on sensitive matters. Especially things that, people might not remember. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Would those be not efficient in a way that if someone starts actively tracking something, it might cause them to start behaving different because they're actively tracking food?
That is a potential problem. That if someone is tracking, suddenly they're tracking their food behavior. All of a sudden, it's like, I ate 5 radishes for lunch. That was my lunch. It was 5 radishes. I swear. I didn't have a, what's that new burger at McDonald's? It looks horrifying. The Big Arch or something. I'm like, it's like 6 Big Macs like glued together somehow. I'm like, is this just the suicide burger? You just want to die? I had 5 radishes instead of a McArch or whatever the heck they call it. Or what was the one? It was at one point at KFC, they had like bacon between 2 fried chicken breasts. And it was like, what is this? Why would anyone eat that? Anyway. yeah, there's definitely social desirability bias too is going to be a problem for these because it's like, okay, yeah, I know I should really eat a salad, but I ate 17 cheeseburgers for lunch today. But I'm going to say salad because I feel better about that. Usually the goal with the diary though is to distance people a little bit. So it's, I'm not like telling you that I ate 5 cheeseburgers for lunch. I'm writing it in a diary. So hopefully I tell you the truth. But yeah, definitely you could have some reactivity from it because as soon as you're like actively thinking about it, you're probably like, maybe you're going to eat better that 1 week so that the researcher that you don't know and have never met doesn't think you're such a glutton. But yeah, definitely. Or, I listen to the classical music station because I'm so cultured. I didn't spend all my time listening to Cardi B. Right, okay. Not that there's anything wrong with Cardi B aside from crassness and lack of talent. But beyond those things, she's fine. What was I saying? All right, let's say disadvantages. Yeah, so typically they're more expensive than personal interviews. They can be really difficult to get. You typically have to pay people a reasonable sum of money to do these kinds of diaries because they are somewhat intensive, right? So they can be really, really difficult to actually get people to comply with. Attrition, yeah, this is the big one. I've tried these like a few times. Marketing companies have they're like, we really want to know about your household because I have a 14-year-old daughter and that's whose media habits they really, really, really want to know about. Because she is like, teenage girls are the superstars of the marketing world because they buy a lot of stuff. So we get targeted for these a lot, especially when marketing companies who all share information apparently find out that you have a teenager at home. They're like, yes, teenage girl, you are a valuable commodity now. So one of the things that happens, obviously, is you do this for like 3 days out of the 7 days, and you're like, bored. Why am I doing this? And so the attrition on them tends to be pretty high. And there's a bit of inaccuracy because what will sometimes happen is, at the end of the 7-day period, you get the reminder. It's like, hey, please submit your media use diary, and then you fill in the whole 7 days at once. And so it might not be super accurate. So details may not be recorded fully enough or accurately because it's something that people are supposed to keep up with for a period of time. It can be a little bit difficult that way. That said, if you can get these to work, man, you get some really interesting data out of them. And here, like, if you're ever curious, go look up a book called Sex and the Soul from Donna Freitas. It's a really, really interesting book, and this is precisely what she did. But it was about sex on college campuses, so the results are really, really fun. Okay, secondary analysis of survey data. The thing that almost brought me to blows with my boss. Okay, because she doesn't like it, and she made a disparaging remark about how people who do secondary analysis of survey data, so it's not your survey, it's a data set that's publicly available, like the General Social Survey in the US or Monitoring the Future and all of this stuff. I mean, if you've taken like sociology of youth with me, I love these freaking surveys because you can, compare stuff going back to like the 1970s with some of these. And so they are it's a fantastic way to do research, and it's really cool because you can take whatever the most recent year is of any kind of survey data, and you can compare it longitudinally across like decades. Sandra's like, yes, but we do our own original research, and we should get more recognition for that. And I'm like, shut up, they published, who cares? Yes, we had an argument. She's German, she argues very well. We had quite an argument about this and her snobby behavior towards people who do secondary survey data, which I think is amazing. And I wish I did more of it. So there's a ton of data that's already out there. Man, oh man. Like if you are interested in some of these longitudinal questions, there are surveys potentially that have been going on since the 70s, sometimes the 1960s. Not in Canada, because Canada sucks at social science data, but in the US especially. The only thing we have in Canada that goes back a really long time is the census. But regardless, we have data that goes back decades in some cases, right? And a ton of quantitative data that inevitably, after a certain period of time, gets published publicly so that you can go and analyze the data yourself, right? So raw statistical data is available on all sorts of topics, right? Almost anything that you can imagine. So if you can think of a topic that you would like to research and you want to do it quantitatively, you can go digging through other people's data, find it, do your own analysis, sometimes compare data sets, look at this data set back to the 1970s for the low price of absolutely nothing other than your subscription to SPSS or Stata or R, right? So there's a fantastic amount of data available out there for people to access. And this is a very, despite what Sandra says, but she's wrong. She's never been wrong about anything in her whole life, even though I respect her tremendously. This is a very valid and very important way that we get data. And certainly, like, if you look at some of my favorite social science researchers like Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt, what they've done in a lot of their analysis is go back decades with stuff like monitoring the future or the college entry survey in the US. And I have a genuine heart for a guy named Ryan Burge, who's at Eastern Illinois University, because he's a religion researcher, and he takes all of these data sets and comes up with some spectacular insights about religion. And obviously I'm a source of religion nerd, and I love it, and I spend way too much of my personal time reading his Substack and other things about social religion. I just got a new report out from Springtide Institute, which I am looking forward to digging into later today. I'm so excited about it. I'm like, ooh, new data. But yeah, like all digging into these existing data sets. And you can come up with some just phenomenal pieces of information and make a hell of a career for yourself. Because frankly, like Ryan, until he started publishing on his Twitter charts about religion, like one visualized chart every day of the year, except for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter. He was nobody, and now he's like, everybody interviews him. Like he's in the New York Times like every week on some religion question. So you can make a hell of a career as an academic analyzing other people's data, and you should, because it's easy and it costs this much, right? You don't even need to apply for research grants. You could just be like, hey, a bunch of data. I guess out of my salary, I can pay $80 to use SPSS and then analyze all that existing data and make a career out of it and get tenure and all of this stuff. So do that. 100% do that. Okay, so advantages. Cost and time. It takes no time. Well, I mean, the analysis takes time, but their data is already collected, so it takes none of your time to collect it. The data tends to be really, really high quality, right? Longitudinal analysis, right? You can compare this again. Some of these things go back, like till the 1960s, like 80 or 60 years, how long is that? 40, 60 years, right? Subgroup analysis, right? You can break this down, because all of the data on demographics is all collected as well. So you can analyze specific subsections of particular groups. You can compare it. You can compare different kind of cultural, racial groups. You can look at similar data sets from different countries that ask similar questions, all of this fun stuff. And because you didn't spend any time collecting the data, you get to spend more time analyzing it, right? So you get to dig in and really learn probably R. You should probably learn R. SPSS is cool, but you should probably learn R. More time for that stuff. And then, years later, you can go back and reanalyze your same data, adding new data sets to the process, which is super cool. And then people can test your data too, right? Because that data is all publicly available. Fulfills the broader, saying something important about society, based on existing data sets is an important part of what social science research should do, and you get to do that. Disadvantages, you know what, there are none. No, I'm kidding. Lack of familiarity with someone else's data. So you might not always have a great sense of how the data was collected. It may take you a little while to sort of familiarize yourself with the code book, but I think that's a relatively minor thing. Data sets can be complex. Yes, they can be very complex. That said, that's kind of the point. And again, you can spend the time you would have spent collecting the data, learning the data set. So that's good. There can be a bit of an ecological fallacy, right? Data gathered by region or neighborhood, such as census data, might be used to make statements about individuals in those places, right? It's like, oh, you're from this part of Edmonton, therefore you are like this based on my statistical reasoning that all people from the north side are XYZ. I'll let you fill in that part for yourself. No control over data quality. So pick good surveys, and that one's gone. This one is a genuine problem. Sometimes you might be like, oh, this is all really interesting. I wish they had asked about this, right? The X is this. Sometimes, because you're using someone else's data set, you might have a really interesting question that links into what they're thinking because it's really important, but they didn't ask it because they didn't think it was important. So with that said, most things are pretty reasonable. By the way, this is NORC, National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago. They have a ton of really cool data, and they're one of the last really big academic centers that has been doing research for like decades. The General Social Survey, which is a little bit small in its sample size in the US, it's only about 1,500 people, comes from them. And a lot of the religion data comes from NORC because, weirdly, the US Census Bureau is barred from asking questions about religion for some reason. How am I doing for time? Bad. Should we stop? What? Okay. Did someone say okay? All right, well, let's stop. Since someone said okay. We'll finish this up on Wednesday. I think I got like literally one slide. Yeah, we'll finish one slide and we'll move on to something else. All right. Oh.